I'm back, and if you're listening, that means that you're back, which means it's time for yet another episode and another installment of our Far Middle podcast. I'm Nick DeUlius. Thank you for tuning in. You can follow me on Twitter at Nick DeUlius. You can also check out my website, nickdeulius.com, where I post new content, new commentary on a regular basis, including each week a chapter-by-chapter release of my upcoming book, The Leech. So please give the website a look when you get a chance. Now, today's podcast and the chapter that it discusses in The Leech is going to sound and feel a little bit different than our prior podcasts and our prior subject matters, and frankly, subsequent ones that we'll talk about in the future. And that's because those predecessors and the ones that we'll talk about down the road, they deal with and discuss threats and clear problems that are threatening society or our economy or our way of life or our kids' futures. This one's going to be different. This one, at times, the podcast is going to come across sounding like it's coming from the perspective of a fan. And frankly, that's because it's true. I am a fan and a follower of the subject matter of this podcast. And the subject matter is the musical group U2, and particularly the lead singer, Bono. I followed that group and have been a fan of it for years, for decades. I think it's the greatest act undoubtedly to come out of Ireland. That's saying something when you consider the island produced acts like Thin Lizzy and Van Morrison, which are great in their own rights. From my perspective, U2 created the greatest album of the 1990s and one of the greatest rock albums of all time with Achtung Baby. That was a total and fresh break for them at the time. Nobody saw that coming that followed U2 or were fans of U2. And what I really like about that album and that effort is that the band did not play it safe. They had a really successful commercial mold going, and they broke it to be creative and basically hit new heights that you can benefit from by just giving that album a listen. Even in today, it just comes out as sounding something completely different, completely fresh. They definitely captured magic in that studio in Berlin where they cut it. And I think it was The Edge, the guitarist for U2, who once said that to him, the opening track or the opening part of the song, The Fly, was the sound of U2 chopping down the Joshua tree. And I think in many respects, that's a great summation of what was occurring at that point in time with their album. Another favorite album of mine is The Unforgettable Fire. I think that's got a great atmosphere, sort of set the sound of U2 from my perspective, where they're trying to settle that and establish that sound and that image. To me, the Unforgettable Fire was the first effort that really did that in a big way. I've seen them live many times in different cities through the years. Another thing I like about them, they've evolved over time. If you think of U2 early on, if you followed them, what do you think of? You think of Bono up there on a stage. I think it was in Red Rocks in Colorado, waving a white flag and singing Sunday, Bloody Sunday. So more of a political band. And they had an era where they were very religious. They then evolved into more of a spiritual, not necessarily religious, but a spiritual mode. They had a phase where they embraced the ironic, coming off of Achtung Baby and some of the later albums that followed it. So they've had this evolution where they're continually changing, continually adjusting. I think bands need to score points for giving that a go. I could dedicate probably a whole series of podcasts just talking about U2's music in the future. Not sure if we'll do that or not, but I will say at the end of this podcast, I'll give a go at ranking their albums, what I think the worst to best albums are of the U2 catalog. So enough of the fandom, so to speak, of U2 and Bono. I mean, if I'm not disliking U2's music, and I like Bono in terms of how he creates his artistic format, then why is this the subject of a podcast or a subject of a chapter in The Leech? The reason is that although Bono is a great example of a successful server, a successful musical artist, a celebrity who is doing everything right in terms of how they're living their life or acting rationally or doing things that pursue their self-interest, there is one arena where he is doing something quite wrong. And what's happening is what Bono is saying and preaching is very different at times from what he is actually doing. So there's an element of inconsistency and hypocrisy perhaps at work that does need to be called out and discussed because, of course, he is very influential as being the front man of one of the most influential entertainment acts on the planet. And if you are doing something that is very different than what you're preaching or advocating for, then that has the potential to make you a useful instrument of the Leech. We've seen how the Leech is very adept, particularly when it comes to the server class of professions, at procuring some of those very influential and visible individuals or entities and using them to perpetrate their own designs. That, I think, is the case that's occurring when it comes to Bono and some of his posturings versus his actions. To be clear on this, because it is important, I love the fact that U2 and Bono have been wildly and widely successful. It doesn't matter if it's profits or income, sales of the band or its merchandise, how they live in terms of estates or mansions at multiple locations, yachts. Those things are things that I have no problem with, and neither should, frankly, any achiever or someone that's achievement-minded. Self-interest, we've talked about this before. Philosophically, self-interest is what drives free enterprise, it's what drives free society. It raises all ships, so to speak, with respect to its tide. We need more Bonos out there, not less, at least as it relates to how his effort and achievement leads to material success. That's a good formula, a good equation for others to pursue. Now, what I don't love and what I lament about Bono is what he says and what he preaches and what he lectures on when you realize it sits at times, as I said, in complete conflict with what he does. That inconsistency and that hypocrisy, when it deals with issues that impact, big issues that impact many people in many places, that can be extremely damaging if it's procured, grabbed a hold of by the Leech, and then used for ill-advised purposes. So what are some examples of where you've got this situation, this contrast of Bono saying and lecturing one set of things and then doing something completely different than what he's saying or lecturing? Let's start with a topic that seems to provide example after example, time and time again, of elites, whether they're individuals or celebrities or organizations or institutions, of elites practicing hypocrisy, and that is the topic of climate change and energy use. Unfortunately, Bono is no exception to this. First, the posturing side of this. When you consider a couple of quotes from Bono on energy and climate, you get a feel for what the lecturing and the posturing positions are. In Tokyo in 2008, he said, quote, "My prayer is that we become better in looking after our planet," end quote. Another quote from '08, this time from Davos, which makes me sort of grimace, just the thought of Bono going to Davos. But he said there, quote, "Turns out that the climate crisis is going to exacerbate that inequality." So he's talking about inequality in climate, I suppose. He also mentioned in that quote from Davos about what he's going to be able to do with Al Gore's tutelage. There's another grimace that you can't see coming across the podcast. A third quote was also telling. This was from, I think, Time magazine, a couple years after the Davos and Tokyo quotes from '08. He said in Time, "The extraction of oil, coal, and minerals brought and still brings a cost to the environment." Well, I suppose that's true, but that's true for any activity or human endeavor, economic endeavor. So he's got this track record of quotes, positions, posturing on very public platforms, whether they're instruments like Time magazine or events like Davos, where he's showing his environmental cred and wanting to display that for all to see. Now let's compare that to the reality. And we could choose a lot of different periods of time or actions to make the point, but we'll pick one in particular, which was their 360-degree world tour. Now, I was there when it hit the road in the States. I saw the tour. It was awesome. But this was no small undertaking, and it had a massive carbon footprint. And why did it have a massive carbon footprint? Well, one, the world runs on carbon. Any major activity is going to rely on carbon, whether you like it or not. That's the scientific and mathematical reality. But two, again, this was a massive undertaking by design. You had multiple stages that were used to help with logistics. So when the band was performing on one stage, the next city or the next venue was using a second set of equipment and stage so that it would help with logistics. Well, that creates, of course, a larger carbon footprint. To move all this stuff around, it took over 100 semis, so over 100 large trucks or 18-wheelers to move this stuff. Of course, they all ran on fossil fuels. The crews to get these things set up and to get the performance successfully executed and all the logistics tied to it, over 130 production crew, 120 local crew, they all had to be transported. They all had to get from point A to point B, largely, once again, on the backs of the carbon molecules and then the carbon atoms within those molecules. The venue itself, when the concert occurs, of course, that concert, from the sound to the lights to the show, is all being done off of electricity, which is largely a fossil fuel-based grid. So there was a carbon footprint tied to the night of the concert itself. All the transportation of fans getting to and from the venues, the jet travel, the private jet travel when it came to U2 and the band members, that had a massive carbon footprint that was quite inefficient. When you add all this up, and someone actually had done the arithmetic tied to this, that 360-degree world tour, in total, it was equivalent on a carbon footprint basis of a passenger jet flying 34 million miles. 34 million miles. If you just look at the first half of the 2009 tour, so that first half leg, it would take 20,000 trees to offset the carbon footprint tied to that tour. Now, a lot of this, when you think about, if you were there and you're familiar with the size of the stage and the monstrosity of the magnitude of the event, it was all there largely for vanity and glitz. Most of it quite unnecessary for a performance. So if you're looking at sound quality or the ability to perform to a large crowd, you didn't need much of the things that were there during that tour that resulted in a significant carbon footprint. And what was funny, I thought, sort of ironic, they asked Edge about this at the time. I think it was BBC Radio. And when they asked him about the carbon footprint tied to the tour and the excesses, so to speak, of the band, his view was, he said, quote, "We'd love to have some alternative to big trucks bringing the stuff around, but there just isn't one," end quote. And I found that ironic, interesting from two perspectives. One, my first thought was, well, of course there's no alternative, because everything, again, scientifically, arithmetically, everything runs off of carbon in this world and will continue to, one way or another, directly or indirectly. But the other side of the interest and irony from my perspective was that, well, I do have another alternative, which would have been a smaller stage, perhaps. So I thought that was an interesting perspective of the Edge that precipitated some interesting thought from my side when I read that quote. This situation with U2 and its energy lifestyle, carbon footprint lifestyle, with respect to its tours or performances versus what it says and how it postures, there's also two parallels that we've seen before and discussed before in prior episodes of the Far Middle podcast. One is, think about our conversations that we've had when it comes to renewable, so-called renewable energy, wind and solar, and the massive carbon footprints that renewables, wind and solar, present at scale. So these, when you do the life cycle and look at each individual step that it takes to develop, say, a wind turbine or a wind farm at scale, and you look at its CO2 footprint across that entire development chain, it is very, very large. So that's similar to what we saw with the 360-degree tour when it comes to looking at all the individual actions, all the individual activities. You add them all up across its life cycle, an enormous carbon footprint. That was an interesting parallel. Another interesting parallel is that we've seen this before, numerous occasions. You've got somebody or something saying one thing, doing a different thing, and when it involves the elites or the community of the elites, they'll typically make a big deal out of some sort of public statement, action, or posturing. And we talked in a prior podcast about Pope Francis, the concept of indulgences, how climate change and energy views these days more and more are lending themselves towards pushing individuals, corporations, society to the practice, the ill-advised practice of indulgences. Well, U2 fell victim to that as well, because one of the things they did with respect to that tour was they made a big deal of paying public indulgences for their energy sins, so to speak, by buying carbon offsets. So that's another, common practice that you see from, again, corporations, celebrities, elite institutions, or individuals, to give them sort of a pass to be able to lecture and posture one way, but then turn around and do something entirely inconsistent. And then because of that sin of their actions, they can buy their way out of it through an indulgence like an offset. Interestingly, the parallel between Pope Francis and Bono when it comes to indulgences, that's not the only parallel we see between those two individuals. There's another one, and it's also another facet to this energy inconsistency that Bono sort of exemplifies. And it ties to a topic that is very popular with him. He's been very passionate about this, and again, as well as Pope Francis, which is world poverty. Now, we saw this issue loom large on our prior podcast. We're going to see the subject of world poverty loom large once again in the next podcast coming up after this one regarding a famous academic. But in the meantime, when it comes to Bono, to his credit, he has spent a lot of time and effort trying to address global poverty. And specifically, a lot of that attention really focused in on Africa. We should applaud him for it. I followed him on that. Much of what he says and much of what he's trying to do should be applauded and frankly should be supported. I'm not here to vilify that by any stretch. And much of his discussions and views on this topic are spot on. So he will point to the role that drugs and pharmaceuticals have played in helping to address African poverty and the role that healthcare in general has played. Those are spot on. But there's also a but side of this. His arguments sometimes fall apart when he starts to really hype the important roles of things like social media. I'm so sure social media has all that crucial of a role to play in the success of eradicating or helping to address poverty in the future when it comes to Africa. And he also vilifies things in a wrong manner, and that is vilifying fossil fuel companies that operate in Africa, and he views them as nothing more than entities that are looking to bribe local governments. Look, the fact of the matter is that carbon has unleashed high quality of life or improving quality of life in pockets of Africa that have had access, have been able to utilize carbon and enjoy electricity and reliable and affordable power generation. Where that has occurred, you've had things like increasing life expectancy, reduced infant mortality rates, improved individual rights, particularly for women. These are the subjects that we've talked about in the past. Now, unfortunately, that hasn't occurred to nearly the extent that we would want it to see across Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, but where energy independence, energy access, energy security via the carbon atom and things like the methane molecule have been allowed and have been unleashed, typically good things along those other metrics have followed. So 6 out of 10 sub-Saharan Africans right now have no access to electricity. So as I said, once again, that's sort of the exception of that success, is the exception, not the rule. We still have 6 out of 10, the majority of sub-Saharan Africans that don't have access to electricity. And of course, Africa needs more carbon extraction, more CO2. Those things would save millions of lives, even if atmospheric CO2 went up incrementally. So there might be a price to pay with atmospheric CO2 going up, but there would be massive immediate benefit in the form of saving or improving millions upon millions of African lives. No, unfortunately, the contrast they are striking with Bono as it relates to his energy policy views. On one side, you've got his actions, multiple mansions, private jet travel, megalomaniacal stage shows, and so on. But then on the other side, you've got the words of lecturing energy companies that are making honest livings, lecturing consumers who are trying to enjoy life's comforts, and lecturing or deciding for the desperate poor how they should behave and when they might improve their quality of life. Those are striking contrasts. And in the end, one of two things needs to occur here. One would be that Bono needs to get his message straight and make it consistent with how he's living his life, or he needs to stop messaging. Or the flip side alternative is he needs to change his actions, drastically change his lifestyle, which I wouldn't recommend that option, so that it's consistent with what he's messaging to the rest of us. There's another popular topic with Bono that he is passionate about that shows a striking contrast between actions and words. That is the topic of debt relief of African nations and tax policy across the board. So like with energy and carbon, there is, as I said, the posturing, and then there is what you're actually doing when it comes to Bono. First, the posturing. He has been a big advocate, much like he did with African poverty. He's been a big advocate of debt forgiveness for African nations by developed nations. That goes back years. He was involved with the efforts of Jubilee 2000, with Drop the Debt, with Make Poverty History campaign. He wrote articles on this. One of his more famous articles on debt relief was titled World Debt Angers Me. And when you look at this topic and assess it and think about it at first blush, it's something that is quite attractive. It's something that you become sympathetic to at first blush. But when you dig a little deeper and you think through root causes, policy implications, etc., the facts and the analysis, they've shown that where debt relief and debt forgiveness has occurred in those African nations, it has simply not changed the way they go about with respect to fiscal discipline, budgeting, and outspending. In many instances, they go right back to prior debt levels, or in some cases, they go beyond that. I discussed this in this chapter that's in the Leech, and the examples that I pointed out were Mozambique and Ghana, but you can choose other nations to assess as well. And it will be interesting because this is an evolving situation. I'd be really interested to see how these data have changed through the pandemic period or era. I suggest or expect that they would. And largely this is why over $1 trillion cumulatively in aid and debt relief for Africa hasn't changed as much as you would hope. And it's why very insightful, intelligent individuals that spend a career in this arena, one in particular, Dambisa Moyo, I'd recommend to you. She wrote an excellent book titled Debt Aid. I'd encourage you to give it a read. They assess the situation and they come away with a similar conclusion that debt forgiveness is not the answer. It does not address the root causes of what is ailing African nations, African national finance, and African economies. Now let's go from this posturing and lecturing when it comes to debt forgiveness for African nations by developed nations. Let's jump over to what occurred with Ireland, interestingly enough, and its tax laws and how that precipitated movements or changes when it came to U2's business interests. In 1969, the late 60s, Ireland exempted artists from income tax. They decided that it was good policy to exempt artists, whether they were authors or musical acts, from income tax. And the idea was to nurture the arts. Now, what happened when they did this was that a lot of famous individuals and acts that were not starving artists by any stretch decided to take advantage of this and set up shop in Ireland. You had acts like Elvis Costello that made the move. Def Leppard is another example. You had authors, Frederick Forsyth. There's a whole list of individuals that we've all heard of or seen or aware of that made the move to Ireland to basically enjoy the exemption from taxes that the Irish government instituted when it came to the arts. This really helped U2. It helped their brand, it helped their image, and frankly, it helped their wallet. Because what it provided was an opportunity for them to stay in Ireland. So they became and reinforced that view of just four normal guys from Dublin that despite their fame, despite their fortune, despite their global profile, they chose to stay in Dublin, in Ireland, and remain true to where they grew up and where their roots were. Created an authenticity, a genuine nature to their brand and to their images. Now, in 2006, Irish law changed. And how did it change? Well, it decided, Ireland did, that it was going to cap the tax exemptions on artists and institute a 40+% rate above the capped level. So when that tax rate changed and it went way up, 40+% beyond a certain cap level, guess what happened? Well, as you might expect, for individuals or entities pursuing their self-interests, U2 decided to quickly relocate their business interests, and they went to the Netherlands. Interestingly, Another famous groups might have set the stage for that, or the template, because the Rolling Stones moved their business interests to the Netherlands right before U2 did. And why the Netherlands? Well, the Netherlands happens to institute and impose only a 5% tax on music royalties. So there you see, on its surface, an action or a move that is very logical. Certainly individuals and entities like Bono, like U2, should pursue their self-interests, minimize their tax liability, be able to keep a bigger share of the value that they create. There is nothing wrong with any of that. But it does contrast starkly with the lecturing that you see when it comes to African debt and dropping African debt, forgiving it by developed nations. There's a definite contrast between the posturing and lecturing on that topic and then what you're actually doing with yourself and with your own business interests and your own profession when it comes to tax planning and Ireland. And there's other examples of Bono lecturing. There's the example of how he's lectured corporations and how they need to be more transparent when it comes to payments and cash flows and taxes and the whole fair share argument, that type of thing. His involvement with One, the lobbying group One, and its views on extractive industries and transparency is a good example of that. But then whether it's the African debt relief issue or extractive industries and transparency of corporations or whatever the case might be, you compare that to the reality. We use the example of where you locate your business interests based off of tax rate, Ireland versus Netherlands. There's the data as well, the statistics as well. 2009 to 2011, U2 grossed hundreds of millions of dollars in revenues, in large part from the highest grossing tour in the history of rock. Yet when you look at the income tax they paid in Ireland in 2010, very, very modest. And to be honest, nobody knows for sure what's going on because, as you can imagine, U2's business entities and structures, I'm sure they're very complicated. It's opaque. It's incredibly difficult to decipher. I couldn't do it for sure. But you see those facts, and I think the facts tell an interesting story and paint an interesting picture. You also have the situation that arose with the Paradise Papers. And the Paradise Papers were leaked documents that showed sort of the murky world of international tax planning and how the elites tax plan. And interestingly, there was a subsection of these Paradise Papers that showed what was going on with a business interest or a set of business interests that were looking at assets in Eastern Europe and offshoring some of those entities for tax shielding and tax advantages. Bono was a part owner of some of those, as we learned through the leaked Paradise Papers, which again wasn't a good optic when you compare that to what his vocal positions have been. And I'd be remiss not to emphasize yet again that there is nothing wrong, inherently wrong, with what Bono or U2 is doing when it comes to their business decisions or their tax planning. All of it, as far as we can tell, is entirely legal and I think entirely ethical. It is ethical to try to retain as much value that you have created for yourself to yourself and not have it be leaked or paid through various taxes and events to third parties or other entities. There's nothing wrong with that. It should frankly be encouraged. But again, it's the inconsistency of what you're doing versus what you're saying. If you're saying something entirely different that's counter to that logic and those actions, that's an inconsistency that needs to be called out. So it's not about Bono enjoying wealth or his standard of living or what the U2 machine's tax planning structures have been. All of those should be pursued and frankly should be applauded. It's what he's saying relative to those actions that is the problem. And you see that in arenas beyond energy and climate change and tax and debt forgiveness. You see it in things like privacy. Privacy when it comes to guarding your privacy as a celebrity. I'm sure Bono is very protective of his privacy and his personal life, as he should be. We would all be in the same situation. But then there's what happened with the Songs of Innocence debacle with iTunes in 2014. If you recall, the Songs of Innocence album was coming out, being ready to be released, and millions and upon millions of iTunes users with accounts woke up one morning or looked on their iPhones one day, and they saw that there was an automatically downloaded complete album of the Songs of Innocence waiting for them. So what if that violation of these smart devices, what if that were done by a government? Would Bono have something to say about that and what it reflects when it comes to invasion of privacy? What if that were done by a global multinational bank? Would Bono take that entity to task? What if another person was doing this to his device, to his smartphone? What if a hacker did this to his smartphone? Of course, he would not be supportive of those moves and would be highly critical. Yet when it came to what was going on with the Songs of Innocence and those forced downloads across millions upon millions of smart devices without consent, that created, once again, a conflict in action versus words. There's also the example of gun violence and gun control. So I'm not here to debate whether you're pro-gun control or pro-Second Amendment or something in between. That's not the issue here. The issue is what's occurring with Bono's posturing and public positions versus what's going on behind the scenes. If you've seen various U2 concerts through the years, one of the more famous numbers that they typically will play in concert is Bullet the Blue Sky. It's a pretty impressive song and presentation of the song live. It's one of those songs that does really well, I think, in a live venue versus the album. And for a certain period of time, I'm not sure if the band still does this today, but for a number of years, the intro video before they would play the song was sort of mocking Charlton Heston and I guess the NRA, and calling out towards the end of the performance, he would call out, Bono would, statistics about gun violence and what the toll would be based on those statistics across the United States. So the message was a pretty stark one, made quite an impression, and was one of pro-gun control and sort of the danger of guns, and perhaps could easily be interpreted as a criticism of the Second Amendment. But then, beyond the stage and beyond the concert and the video and the posturing and the shouting out of statistics by Bono, then there was what was going on with Elevation Partners. Elevation Partners was a multi-billion-dollar private equity fund that was focusing on investment opportunities in media and tech, and Bono was a co-founder of it. He's a smart guy. I mean, he's got interests and has success far beyond cutting and putting out great albums. And in 2005, Elevation Partners acquired BioWare Pandemic. And this was a venture of a video game entity that was basically marketing or selling, creating shoot-'em-up games played mostly by kids or teens or impressionable young adults. And it was the shoot-'em-up fare that you would typically see with these video games. It was glorifying and making gun violence entertaining. So it was games that was enabling or using different forms of firearms to kill different types of things or blow up different types of things. That was in 2005. A couple years later, Elevation Partners sold this venture of BioWare Pandemic for hundreds of millions of dollars, reaping a pretty tidy profit, a nice profit in a relatively short period of time. So once again, saying, lecturing, gun violence issues, gun control advocacy, perhaps anti-Second Amendment views, but then turning around and co-founding a venture that is investing in another venture that is making its living and making you hundreds of millions of dollars off of the entertainment and glorification of gun violence seems to be quite inconsistent and hypocritical. Coming down the home stretch of this episode of the Far Middle Podcast, the reason why this is pertinent with respect to what's going on with Bono and U2 is that he is a very visible entity and a very visible band that has a tremendous amount of influence. They're influencers on many crucial global topics. And that influencer trait carries a responsibility because others understand the influence that Bono carries, and they may be, if they are sort of applying the Leech way and have not the interests of creators, enablers, and servers at heart, they may be willing, very willing, to sort of commandeer Bono and his influence and platform in a way to further those interests that are working against creators, enablers, and servers. We see, as I said time and time again on this podcast, the vast majority of his actions are pursuing his self-interest. That's what makes free enterprise hum. It doesn't matter if it's he and the band creating great music. It doesn't matter if it's enjoying the high quality of life that he's got through large energy consumption, minimizing tax, promoting your brand however you promote it under the different ethical and legal means that are out there, being very guarded of your privacy, and just making money through good business decisions. All of those things, once again, are things that we should embrace and celebrate about him and the band. The problem here is the hypocrisy, the inconsistency that just pops up when you superimpose what he's saying over those actions. They just don't jive. They don't match up. And perhaps the best example I can close with is of this at play, this inconsistency at play, is when Bono was speaking to the media a couple of years back. I think it was the summer of 18 in New York at the United Nations. And he was lobbying at the time for Ireland to be added to the 15-member Security Council. I think it was in 2021 that it would have happened as a non-permanent member. And he gave a nice speech to a fawning media that were there, and he gave popular shout-outs to the United Nations and the EU and the G7 and World Trade Organization and the WTO, the Paris Climate Agreement. He just ran through a whole list of things, most of which I've got huge issues with, and I think work against creators, enablers, and servers and individual rights. But yet, the media love, and they just glowingly showered praise on Bono for his position and his speech. But one sentence in this speech by Bono at the UN in New York really stood out for me. He said, quote, "You can count on Ireland to do its part in that work," end quote. And this, to me, sort of summarizes the issue of Bono and why he is a subject of a chapter in the upcoming book, The Leech. So if Bono wants to do his share of this work, of the things that he advocates for, whether it be climate change advocacy and carbon reduction or a carbon-free world, or paying your fair share of tax, whether it's a developed nation or an individual that is doing well, or respecting privacy, or gun control, or on and on it goes, well, then he needs to do a couple of things if he wants to do his part. He should drop the private jet and fly commercial with the rest of us. He should drop the big concerts that have those massive carbon footprints. He should drop all of his mansions and basically live in a very modest abode like most people do. He should start paying 40+% tax. That would happen if he just simply recentered the YouTube business interests in Ireland based on the current tax laws. He should transparently disclose on a platform that everybody can see all the business filings and incomes and positions and deductions at all the different business interests that he has a hand in is taking. He should donate all that money that he made to the BioWare pandemic venture sale to gun control advocacy groups, because that in some ways is dirty money. And he should allow others, whoever they are, might be an author, it could be a musical act, to download content onto his devices whenever they would feel like they had the desire to do so. He should do all those things. Or perhaps any alternative, he should stop the lecturing so that it's not going to be done in a way that's inconsistent and hypocritical with his actions. All right, as promised, let's wrap up this episode of the Far Middle Podcast talking about and ranking, at least from my perspective, the 14 U2 studio albums from worst to best, from 14 on up to 1. I'm excluding in this list the live album Under a Blood Red Sky, so I'm going to keep that one out. So there's been 14 studio albums, and I think out of those 14, there's only one that I really just do not enjoy in some form, some way. And interestingly, that's their most recent release, which is the Songs of Experience album. Can't get into it, don't appreciate it or enjoy it. In fact, it's the only U2 album that I don't own, and I really don't see myself owning it anytime in the near future. I don't know what it is about it. A lot of critics like that album. They think it's a really good, strong piece of work and accomplishment by the band. I don't get it, so enough said about that one. Number 13 on my list is an older album, which is October. This was released, I think, in 1981, in the early 80s, so this goes way back in the band's history, and you can tell they're still struggling to find their signature, their sound, their brand. Gloria is a single off that album that's really good, still a classic, but beyond Gloria, not much there for me at least. I put October in at number 13. Number 12 is a more recent release, which is No Line on the Horizon. This came out in 2009. A couple good songs there on that album. I like Magnificent. I think that's a good one. Get on Your Boots is another good one that you'll hear and get a lot of radio play with. But all in all, nice, solid album. Listen to it from time to time. But I rank that pretty low on the list, coming in at number 12. And then this next album here is the last one in that group of the bottom four that I sort of put in the bottom bucket. And number 11 I've got as Pop, the album Pop. Came out in the late 90s. Some good songs there, good singles. Discotheque's a good one. Staring at the Sun is good. Last Night on Earth, solid. Has that feel of that era for the band when they were in their ironic phase, coming a couple albums and years off of Achtung Baby. But with respect to that group and that time period, that group of albums in that time period, probably put Pop at the bottom of that grouping. So, as I said, that bottom bucket of those four albums: Pop at number 11, No Line on Horizon 12, October 13, and Songs of Innocence at the bottom there at number 14. Now, the second group of albums are very, very solid. In some instances, just great. But there's such a wide selection to choose from. They haven't made it into the upper echelon from my perspective of the best. And starting here at number 10, I'm going to put Zooropa. Zooropa, I love that album. It came out in the early 90s, coming off of Achtung Baby. Zooropa, the title track, Stay, is a great song. Stay might be one of their best songs. Dirty Day, I like the song Dirty Day. I thought that was a really good effort. So Zooropa is just a solid piece of work. Can listen to that anytime. How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb, number 9. That coming out in 2004. Vertigo, everybody knows Vertigo. City of Blinding Lights, I think that's one of the most unappreciated, underrated singles, songs from U2. It's a really good song, well constructed, and it comes across really effectively live. There was a tour, and it might have been the How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb tour, where that was the opening song to the tour, and it was really a great opening intro to the concert. Number 8 album, Songs of Innocence, 2014. I love certain songs on Songs of Innocence. California is an outstanding song. Every Breaking Wave, Cedarwood Road, which goes back to Bono's childhood and when he was a kid in Dublin. That's a song that doesn't get a lot of attention. They did play it in concert on that tour, but I think it's just an outstanding song. You can feel the emotion coupled with the music. So Songs of Innocence is a really popular album when it comes to what I listen to and when it comes to the U2 catalog. Number 7 is Boy, going back in time, 1980. Boy came out before October, so again, a time when they were still looking for their sound and their sort of personality as a band. But, I mean, anything that's got I Will Follow on it, that's probably the ultimate U2 single, right? But then it's coupled with The Electric Company and Out of Control. Those are also some really classic older songs from U2. That trio alone really elevates Boy up to number 7. Number 6, All That You Can't Leave Behind. Came out at the Millennium, 2000. Beautiful Day. Everybody likes that song. Walk On. I think Walk On, like City of Blinding Light, is another very underrated U2 single. It's an awesome song. Give it a listen when you get a chance. Stuck in a Moment is a great one. I heard at some point that's a song about his Bono's relationship with Michael Hutchence from In Excess and his suicide, which was a tragedy. In Excess is a great act. But Stuck in a Moment, I love that song. New York's a good song. Elevation, everybody knows Elevation, right? So that album, there's 5 solid songs that I just listed off that album, All That You Can't Leave Behind. Number 5, probably the best of that second bucket of really solid U2 albums, Rattle and Hum. I've always liked Rattle and Hum in the late 80s. You got Desire, Silver and Gold, Angel of Harlem, God Part 2. That's another. I think that's the best song on the album, but nobody seems to listen to God Part 2. You don't hear it anymore, but give that a listen if you haven't recently. And then you got all the live performances that are on that album. And that was sort of their period where they were trying to capture Americana. They were trying to become Elvis. They were spending a lot of time in Memphis. They were out there across the United States. You just see them like driving on Route 66, staying in motels and little diners and things like that. An interesting time in their history. So that leaves 4 albums. And these 4 are the upper echelon, the best of the best of an awesome group and an awesome body of work. And you can probably list these albums in any order, and you're not going to get a big argument from me. But here's how I see it. Number 4 is War. 1983 release, Sunday Bloody Sunday, right? New Year's Day. Is there a more powerful 1-2 combination on any U2 album than Sunday Bloody Sunday and New Year's Day? I think not. And then another favorite of mine that gets completely dissed. People hate, critics hate, Two Hearts Beat as One. I like that song. I've always liked that song. So I sort of give it a plus, the album War, just because that's on there. And of course, 40, right? 40's been the anthem that they always close their concerts out for years and years and decades. That War album is just outstanding. Number 3, Unforgettable Fire, 1984 release. I mentioned earlier in this podcast, one of my favorite albums. I just think that feel, that album has a feel like none other, and it really is, it just captures U2 in its essence. A Sort of Homecoming is an excellent track. Wire, Bad. I mean, Bad, again, might be the ultimate U2 song in some views. Pride, outstanding song. Unforgettable Fire, the title track. So that album, it just feels like U2. It feels like Ireland, and they just captured an overall sense with that release that is consistent through and through. I love the Unforgettable Fire. Number 2, I've got Joshua Tree. Now, most critics, most people put Joshua Tree number 1, and I mean, again, you can't argue with that, but I've got it at number 2. It's just stacked. That album's stacked with hits from and songs and impressionable songs from start to finish. You got Where the Streets Have No Name, With or Without You, One Tree Hill, underrated song. Still haven't found what I'm looking for. We mentioned Bullet to Blue Sky earlier. I really like Red Hill Mining Town. That's another song that most people don't pay attention to or hear often. It's an excellent song. Trip Through Your Wires is a good one. And Exit. Exit might be the darkest U2 single or song that they ever created, and I really like Exit. But Joshua Tree, it just, I mean, you go through the track list, and how could you not rank it really, really high? And of course, no surprise, I think, if you've been listening to the podcast, my number 1 U2 album of all time is Achtung Baby, 1991, reset the band, changed the sound, influenced countless others out there in the industry performing. Zoo Station, love that song. One, The Fly, even better than The Real Thing, and Until the End of the World. Achtung Baby, very much like the Unforgettable Fire, just has a feel to it from start to finish. And I listen to that album, it just takes me back to the early 90s. It feels like I've just been transported right back there, not just with respect to the music and what that band was doing with that creation, but what was going on with my life personally. That's one of the great things I think about solid music, whether it's a song or an album. If it takes you back to that time when you first experienced it, or when it was, very popular or prominent, then it's sort of doing its job with respect to trying to create a connection to you that goes beyond just the notes that you're listening to. It creates an emotion. And that, in my opinion, is what good music is all about. So there you have it, for what it's worth. Probably not worth much, but it's my podcast, and I wanted to run to the chance to list out my ranking of the 14 U2 albums in order, again, for what it's worth. Well, I hope you enjoyed this version of the Far Middle Podcast. We're going to be in touch once again in a short period of time, and we've got yet another interesting topic on deck to discuss for you when we next meet. Until then, stay safe and take care.